All right, in about 520 AD, as a continuation of what we were talking about, um, an Italian monk by the name of Benedict would write a book that described all the rules for being a monk. Not exactly a real uh, page turner, I don't think. But anyway, he founded this order of monks called the Benedictine order. Now, it was a pretty big deal because primarily the Benedictines would be the most popular order of monastery throughout Europe for much of the 15, for much of the 5, 6, and 700 AD. And so Benedict wrote this book. Everybody was like, hey, cool, this guy's awesome. Let's join up with his monastery. In 590, Gregory the First would become the Pope. And so under Gregory the First, the church would begin to seize different secular powers. Okay, now primarily leading up to this point, leading up to 590, the only powers the church had were the powers of religion. Right? I mean, if you were religious, then cool, whatever the church said, you probably did. But as a lot of people in Europe were not religious, they didn't care much for the church. Well, by 590, Gregory the First, he says, okay, we've got to expand the power of the church even more. And so they will begin their expansion at this point. Now, we're going to talk about this because in around 900 to 1000 to about 1100 AD, the church becomes one of the most powerful entities in Europe. The church will own more land, for example, than any other entity within Europe. I mean, even like empires and kingdoms didn't have as much land as the church ended up having. So that's a pretty big deal. So Gregory would declare that the church has control of the land from Italy to England and from Spain to Germany. And of course, that is a very large area of land. And not only would they declare that they had control of that land, they'd also raise armies, they'd build and repair roads, and they'd help the poor, which, those are all good things as well. But having control of land and having huge armies wasn't necessarily a great thing. But we'll talk a little bit more about that later when we actually talk about the Crusades, because that's probably the most notable instance of the church abusing its military. All right, let's talk about Charlemagne. All right, so in 719, Charles Martel becomes, with the blessing of the church, of course, the major domo of the Franks. Okay, and we talked about Clovis. So Charles Martel would be like Clovis's great grandson. And so he becomes the major domo, which simply means the mayor of the people of the Franks. And he actually will go up against some Muslims, and we'll talk about this in just a minute, which earns him the nickname of Charles the Hammer. Okay, so Charles Martel becomes known as Charles the Hammer. He defeats the Muslim raiders in Europe at the Battle of Tours in 732 AD. And because of that defeat, he will largely be able to keep Islam out of Europe. And essentially, it's still today, most European countries are not Islamic, and that's because of Charles Martel. Because he'll stop them at Tours, which is a southern French town just outside of Spain. And so because he's able to keep Islam out of Europe, he becomes a Christian hero, and they basically treat him like a saint. Now, they never will actually saint him and say he's Saint Charles Martel. That doesn't happen, but he does get considered a very important figure in church history. All right, so Charles, when he dies, he passes his power on to his son, a man by the name of Pepin the Short. And yes, he's called Pepin the Short because he's short. And when he does so, he starts a dynasty known as the Carolingian dynasty. Okay, so that's a pretty big deal. And then, again, like I said, this is French. He passes his power on to Pepin the Short, which starts the Carolingian dynasty. Now, under Pepin the Short, we would see Carloman and Charles. Now, what was notable about Pepin the Short, besides the fact that he is the father of Charlemagne, was that he was one of the first kings in Europe to be kinged by the Pope, and the Pope declared him the king by the grace of God. Okay, which basically says that the Pope is saying, oh yeah, God approved it, so he gets to be king. So Pepin will die in 768 AD, and he'll leave his kingdom to his two sons, Carloman and Charles. Now, Carloman will die in 771 of mysterious causes, most likely because Charles was jealous because Carloman was a little bit older and he wanted to do away with him so he could take over the kingdom. Happened all the time. But Charles would end up killing Carloman off probably in 771. And so Charles becomes known as Charlemagne, which means Charles the Great. Okay, it's French for Charles the Great, so Charlemagne. Now, in 800, Charlemagne's going to travel to Rome. So he leaves France, he leaves this area here, and he will travel to Rome. And what he ends up doing there is all the Germanic tribes, and if you remember that map I showed you a little while ago, there was tons of Germanic tribes in this area here. He'll move in, and he'll basically take them over. He'll conquer them all and take them over. So his empire, by about 800 AD, will look kind of like this darker brown area here, just a huge, giant, powerful empire that ends here at the kind of the middle of the boot. Now, Rome's right about here, so very close to Rome. And so when he gets to Rome, and this is a pretty controversial story. Now, a lot of this is legend, but I want to tell you guys the story anyway. He gets there, and Leo III, the Pope, he says, why don't you come into Rome, and we'll have a big ceremony, and I want to crown you as the Emperor of Rome. Now, he wasn't Roman. Keep that in mind. Charlemagne was Frank. It was from France. And so Leo III says, come into Rome. You get here, and I will crown you as the Emperor of Rome. Now, the big deal there was this. This is the Pope. He is a religious figure. He doesn't have any control of the kingdom of Rome from the aspect of who gets to be king. That's not a power he has. So by inviting Charlemagne into Rome, where he will crown him, basically what he is trying to do, without actually saying it, is Pope Leo II is trying to indicate that the Pope is more powerful than kings. Okay, he basically is saying the Pope has the ability to crown kings, therefore I gave you your power, I am more powerful. Now, as the story goes, what ends up happening is Charlemagne gets to Rome and goes through this whole ceremony, and right at the end of the ceremony, as Pope Leo III is about to put the crown on him, he grabs it from him and places it on himself, therefore becoming king by his own right, if you will. Now, that's probably all legend, but it's kind of a fun story to talk about. So anyway, Charlemagne, though, will become the very first Holy Roman Emperor. And so basically what Pope Leo III says is all the emperor that used to be Rome is now arranged under the church, because I'm the Pope, and Charlemagne, you are the new emperor, and so it's called the Holy Roman Emperor. Now, many historians will kind of, it's sort of a joke among historians, but they'll say the Holy Roman Emperor was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. And so there was a lot of not holy things going on. It was certainly not Roman. It was all Germanic tribes linked together, which we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And it was not really an empire from the aspect of all the people that were living in it were pretty much Germanic. So they weren't living under various groups of people. All right, but let's talk about Charlemagne leading a revival to finish this thing off with. So Charlemagne, once he becomes king, he starts to have his family study the arts and literature at his palace. And so he will kind of start a small revival in Europe of learning. Because when the king does something, it's cool, right? When the king's not doing something, it's not cool. So Charlemagne, he starts reading, he starts having his family study. So that kind of spreads out throughout the kingdom, and a lot of people will start doing that. But we call this the Carolingian Renaissance. It won't last very long, about 100 years is all. But for a time there, people in Europe began to kind of put an emphasis on education. In fact, as the story goes, which is yet another legend, Charlemagne, who never learned how to read growing up, had decided at an old age he wanted to learn how to read. And so he often kept a copy of Homer's Odyssey under his pillow, and he would pull it out at night and try to read it. And that's how the legend goes. But Charlemagne, the important piece here is he'll lay the basis for feudalism. Now, we're going to talk a little bit more about feudalism next time, and I'm going to give you an example of what feudalism really is. But the big deal about feudalism, and this is the way of life for many Europeans for much of the Middle Ages. I mean, most of Europe was under feudal control. And we'll talk about what feudalism is and how it plays into European history. So when feudalism comes, or excuse me, when Charles comes to power, he is going to start giving sections of his estates to counts who are responsible for ruling those sections justly. And they had to pay, basically had to pay loyalty and homage to Charlemagne. And that's really where we get the start of feudalism. And then basically that's how the feudal system works. All right, so when Charlemagne dies, he's going to divide, well, he gives it first to his son, Louis the Pious, who was crowned emperor in 814, was a devout Christian, but not such a great leader. I mean, he was really religious, hence the name Louis the Pious, not such a good leader. When he dies, then his three sons, Lothair, Charles the Bald, and Louis the German, are going to end up fighting each other for control of the empire. Okay, and so consequently, they're going to wind up breaking the empire apart. In 843, they sign a treaty called the Treaty of Verdun, which they agreed to stop fighting each other, but they also agreed to completely break the empire apart. So if you look, Louis the German's part is this darker yellow. Lothair's part is this kind of, I don't know, almost a whitish yellow. It's not a great color. And then Charles the Bald, his part is this green part here, which includes Paris and Orleans. So that created three different kingdoms, in which case all three of these different kings, Louis the German, Lothair, and Charles the Bald, are going to pay homage to each other, and they're going to break up their kingdoms even further, therefore creating this huge intricate system that we know as feudalism. All right, so you are going to go on to watch this film on PBS called Castle by David Macaulay, which kind of gives you a great idea of how these guys began to build castles and why they began to build castles. So next time when I get back, if you don't finish that film, we will finish it together. But then I'm also going to kind of give you guys an idea of how feudalism actually worked. So until next time, we'll see you later.